The evening had fallen upon London with a slow, deliberate grace, as if the city itself had paused to admire the elegance it bore. Gas lamps flickered along cobblestone streets, their trembling light caught in the glossy sheen of the recently polished carriages, and through the wide windows of the grand ballroom, candlelight glimmered like captured stars. The Hawthorne estate, a modest, noble residence by comparison to the gilded palaces of wealthier peers, thrummed with a nervous vitality, every servant and guest alike participating in the careful choreography of appearances. Eliza Hawthorne, standing at the threshold of her first public presentation, felt the weight of generations pressing upon her delicate shoulders. She was, by all measures, a girl of uncommon poise and intelligence. Yet tonight she was to be measured against a society that prized fortune and lineage over wit or courage. Her gown, a soft lavender silk with a sweep of lace at the neckline, clung to her like the fragile promises whispered to debutantes of old. She clasped her gloved hands before her, smoothing the folds as if that small motion could steady her heart. The chatter of the assembled elite swirled around her, whispers of alliances, judgments, and veiled malice. But none of it reached the calm, steady rhythm she cultivated in her mind. She had learned, through years of careful observation, that composure could shield one against the sharper edges of the world. And yet, when he entered, all her careful defenses faltered. Lord Sebastian Blackwood, Duke of Ashbourne, appeared as though summoned by the very shadows themselves, his presence commanding even as he moved with an economy of gesture that spoke of control and discipline. His dark eyes swept the room with a calculated attention, finally resting on her with a gaze that was both appraising and dismissive. The room seemed to hush in response, a subtle tension threading itself through the air. He approached, each step measured, deliberate, as if the space between them were a distance to be conquered rather than merely crossed. "You were forced into my life, not meant for me," he said, his voice low and precise, carrying a chill that penetrated the polite warmth of the ballroom. The words struck Eliza as though flint had met steel, and for a moment she felt the heat of shame rise to her cheeks. Not for her appearance, nor for her family's precarious position, but for the audacity of hope she had dared to cultivate. To be seen as a choice, rather than an obligation, had never been her expectation, and yet the cold finality of his tone carved a new certainty into her thoughts. She lifted her chin, holding her composure, and allowed herself a measured curtsy. "I shall endeavor to honor the obligations that circumstance demands, Your Grace," she murmured, careful to keep the tremor from her voice. Her words were polite, restrained, yet beneath the civility lay a spark of defiance, a quiet insistence that while she might not choose the union that fate, or her family, had arranged, she would not surrender her dignity. Around them, the world continued, oblivious to the subtle storm brewing in the quiet tension between the young woman and the Duke. Servants moved with unobtrusive precision. Chandeliers reflected the flickering firelight, and the distant strains of string quartet underscored the ceremony of appearances. Yet within that carefully maintained decorum, a battle of wills had begun, silent but unmistakable, a contest not of brute force but of intellect, courage, and the unspoken demand to be seen. Eliza's mind wandered briefly to the women who would never have this choice, whose fates were sealed by circumstance alone, and a pang of empathy softened the edge of her humiliation. She had been thrust into this life of gilded constraint, yet even within it, she could carve a small space of autonomy, a place where wit and courage might bloom unseen. She resolved, silently, that she would not allow herself to be consumed entirely by the expectations of others. There would be defiance, subtle yet resolute, and a measure of agency she would claim for herself, even under the scrutinizing gaze of the Duke. The Duke, for his part, turned his attention to the other guests, his expression unreadable. Yet Eliza sensed that he too had been momentarily unsettled, that beneath the veneer of control there lingered the faint stirrings of curiosity, and perhaps even admiration, though neither would admit it aloud. For a society governed by whispers, The smallest deviation from protocol could carry consequences measured in scandal, and each of them understood the delicate balance they had begun to navigate. As the orchestra swelled with a familiar waltz, Eliza allowed herself a single, quiet exhale, feeling the moment stretch like the silken folds of her gown. The night had begun, and with it, a journey she had not chosen but must now navigate with both caution and courage. The words of the Duke lingered like the last note of a violin in a silent hall, a challenge she could neither ignore nor dismiss. And in that charged silence, she knew, though the path ahead was uncertain, she would meet it on her own terms, even if the world sought to define them for her. Days passed with a deliberate, measured pace, each one etched with the rigid rituals of high society. Eliza Hawthorne found herself navigating a world that valued appearances above all, where every smile was scrutinized and every gesture weighed for hidden meaning. Yet amid the ornate parlors and the whispered evaluations of matrons and debutantes, she discovered a world beyond gilded walls, a world of soot-streaked streets, cramped rooms, and women whose lives were dictated by labor and necessity rather than wealth or station. It was in this shadowed London, far from chandeliers and velvet carpets, that Eliza's courage found its quiet expression. By day, she engaged in lessons, embroidery, and music, presenting the exacting facade her family expected, while by night she ventured into the workshops where seamstresses labored under dim candlelight, stitching garments for pennies and dreaming in colors their pockets could not afford. She carried with her modest gifts spools of fine thread, scraps of silk, and small coins, but it was the simple act of recognition, of listening to whispered grievances and soft laughter, that mattered most. In those moments, her own burdens, the engagement, the scrutiny, the whispered judgments, seemed to dissolve, leaving only a sense of purpose that was entirely her own. Yet even in this carefully cultivated sanctuary, the presence of Lord Sebastian Blackwood could not be entirely escaped. He began to notice her subtle absences, the faint wear of late nights beneath her otherwise immaculate composure. There was a tension in his regard, an unspoken calculation as he observed the small but significant defiance of her actions. The Duke, a man of precise expectations and unyielding standards, found himself intrigued against his will, a curiosity that bordered on obsession. He left a book on her dressing table one evening, an obscure volume on philanthropic work among the poor, with a note in delicate script. "Perhaps you may enlighten me, Miss Hawthorne, on what I have so far failed to understand." Eliza read the note with a mixture of amusement and apprehension. It was at once a challenge and an acknowledgement, a slender bridge between the rigid walls of their respective duties. She understood the implication. He had seen her, not merely as an obligation, but as a mind capable of thought and action beyond the limits of his expectations. Yet she refused to be ensnared by curiosity alone. Her movements, her charity, remained measured, careful, for she understood the peril that could accompany even the smallest misstep in a world so quick to judge. The rising tension of her dual existence culminated one evening at a dinner intended to solidify social alliances. A misdelivered letter, meant for the eyes of a philanthropic contact, found its way into the hands of a jealous relative. Words praising her nocturnal visits to the workshops were read aloud with exaggerated horror, and a murmur of scandal began to ripple through the assembled company. Gasps punctuated polite laughter, and a few sharp glances were directed toward the Duke, as if to ask how a man of his station could countenance such impropriety. Sebastian's response was measured, his dark gaze sweeping the room with the calm authority of a man accustomed to command. Yet in the quiet moments after the initial shock, he confronted Eliza in the privacy of the library. "You place yourself in peril where none need go," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Your family's reputation, our reputations, may hang by the slenderest of threads." Eliza met his eyes steadily. "And yet, I cannot stand idly by while others suffer, even if it be at the cost of propriety. I am compelled by conscience, not whim. If scandal comes, so be it. I would rather risk shame than inaction." Her words were measured, yet beneath them lay a fire that refused to be dimmed. In that quiet confrontation, the subtle dance of respect and challenge deepened. Sebastian's eyes, usually so guarded, betrayed a flicker of admiration, though he would not grant it in words. The tension between them was no longer merely social. It was personal, a silent recognition of kindred spirits constrained by circumstance. Each gesture, each glance, became imbued with meaning. A touch of a gloved hand, a deliberately prolonged pause, a book left in her chamber that bore the weight of both invitation and caution. By the week's end, the social machinery continued its relentless march, yet the undercurrent between Eliza and Sebastian had shifted. The Duke's intrigue, once purely observant, had taken root, and Eliza's quiet defiance had gained strength, emboldened by the knowledge that she could act without entirely defying the rigid expectations of her class. Outside, London's streets remained dark and soot-streaked, candles flickered in modest workshops, and the world pressed on with indifferent rigor. Yet within the walls of the Hawthorne estate, a storm of subtle rebellion, curiosity, and unspoken longing began to stir, promising consequences that neither duty nor decorum could fully contain. As Eliza prepared for another evening of careful engagement with society, a small smile touched her lips. She had survived her first confrontation with scandal, and in doing so, had glimpsed a measure of agency that no wealth or title could secure. The Duke, silent and inscrutable, remained a constant presence at the periphery of her consciousness, a figure both imposing and magnetic, whose judgment she both feared and sought to challenge. The path ahead was uncertain, yet charged with possibility, and the night, heavy with candlelight and whispers, seemed to pulse with the unspoken promise that nothing in their carefully ordered world would remain unchanged for long. The storm had arrived that evening with an unexpected fury, rattling the windows of the Hawthorne estate and sending the firelight flickering across the walls in restless shadows. Rain struck the leaded glass with a persistent rhythm, a percussion that echoed the tension lingering in the corridors. Eliza Hawthorne had been pacing the drawing room, her thoughts a tumult of anxiety and determination, knowing that the scandal from the previous week had yet to fully settle. Rumors, like persistent embers, continued to smolder, threatening to ignite the careful facade of her family's reputation. She could feel the eyes of society pressing upon her even in absence, each whisper a cold hand tracing the lines of her conscience. A soft knock at the door drew her attention. Sebastian entered, coat damp, his dark hair slightly disheveled by the wind, and the faintest shadow of concern crossed his otherwise impervious features. He moved with the deliberate calm that had become familiar, yet the storm outside seemed mirrored in the tension he carried within him. "The letter," he said, his voice low, "has reached the wrong hands. The entire assembly of my peers questions my judgment, and they seek to exploit it." Eliza met his gaze steadily, refusing to flinch at the weight of accusation. "I acted for those whose voices are seldom heard, Your Grace. The responsibility for scandal is not mine alone, nor is the honor of this household diminished by acts of compassion." Her words, though measured, carried the authority of one who had chosen principle over convenience. He studied her in silence, the storm outside providing the only accompaniment to the unspoken dialogue between them. For the first time, he allowed the faintest acknowledgement of vulnerability to surface. "You place yourself in danger where none need go," he said again, softer this time, almost as if testing the bounds of propriety and concern. "Yet I cannot deny that your courage is remarkable." Remarkable. The word struck her with an odd mixture of warmth and surprise. To hear praise from the Duke, whose judgment had seemed infallible and unyielding, felt at once like a balm and a challenge. Eliza knew that her actions had drawn his attention not merely as a subject of observation, but as a force compelling recognition and respect. Yet she also knew that admiration could easily twist into expectation, and she would not allow herself to be constrained by even his gaze. The room seemed to contract as they moved closer, drawn by necessity and circumstance into a sphere of intimacy they had neither chosen nor anticipated. Sebastian extended a hand toward the desk, retrieving a small, carefully wrapped package. "I thought it prudent to leave this here," he said, his tone betraying a hesitation that he seldom allowed. Inside was a simple notebook, bound in dark leather, filled with sketches and notes detailing the lives and struggles of London's working poor, an extension, perhaps, of the curiosity he had begun to nurture in secret. Eliza traced her gloved fingers across the cover, feeling the weight of thought and care embedded within. "You have taken upon yourself to understand what you barely knew," she said softly. "It is uncommon for a man of your station to consider such matters beyond the immediate concern of wealth and title." Sebastian's jaw tightened, the corner of his mouth lifting in a fleeting, reluctant smile. "And yet, you have taught me otherwise, Miss Hawthorne. You have shown me that the measure of a person is not in what they inherit, but in what they choose to protect." His voice, low and steady, carried a resonance that was more than mere acknowledgement. It was an unspoken confession of the stirrings of respect, and perhaps something more, deep within him. A sudden clap of thunder silenced both of them, and in that charged quiet, the boundaries between duty and desire blurred. Eliza felt the stirrings of something she had long kept subdued, a recognition that Sebastian's rigid exterior concealed depth she could neither fully comprehend nor resist. She realized that the danger of scandal, the careful measure she had taken to preserve propriety, had become a shared burden, binding them in ways that neither society nor circumstance could easily untangle. "I do not seek to manipulate or entrap you," she whispered, her voice nearly drowned by the wind outside. "Yet I cannot ignore the truth that my heart is no longer indifferent to you." The words hovered between them, fragile and potent, carrying the weight of both confession and defiance. Sebastian's eyes darkened, his usual composure faltering beneath the intensity of the admission. He stepped closer, the space between them charged with attention neither could dismiss. "And yet," he murmured, "you are bound by duty as I am, and still you choose to defy expectation. It is unbearable and extraordinary." They stood, silent but acutely aware of one another, as the storm raged beyond the walls, each drop of rain a percussion on the fragile barrier between propriety and desire. In that moment, it was no longer merely society that constrained them, but the careful negotiation of hearts unaccustomed to yielding. And yet, in the quiet rebellion of acknowledgement, they glimpsed the possibility that their fates, though tangled in obligation and expectation, might be guided by choice, courage, and the stirrings of a love neither had fully anticipated. The thunder softened, and a muted light broke through the curtains, as if granting permission for the unspoken bond to take root. Eliza, her pulse steady despite the storm, felt the certainty of her own agency and the quiet acknowledgement of Sebastian's burgeoning regard. The night, once oppressive with duty and fear, had shifted, leaving in its wake the first trace of a path neither had dared to traverse openly, a path that promised both peril and the profound intimacy of hearts awakened to one another. The morning air was crisp with the promise of renewal, the first light of dawn filtering through the tall windows of Ashbourne Manor, casting a pale gold over the grand drawing room. Outside, the gardens were still damp from an overnight rain, petals glistening like dewdrops of molten silver, and a scent of wet earth mingled with the faint perfume of early blooming roses. Eliza Hawthorne moved among the elegant furnishings with a quiet deliberation, her thoughts both anchored in the weight of yesterday's scandal and buoyed by the fragile hope that courage might yet reshape their fates. She had chosen action over silence, risk over submission, and in so doing had awakened a measure of respect, perhaps even admiration, in the man she was bound to marry. Sebastian Blackwood entered without announcement, his presence as commanding as ever, yet softened by the faint trace of vulnerability that had begun to emerge in private moments. He removed his gloves, the gesture deliberate, almost ceremonial, and fixed his gaze upon her with an intensity that demanded attention yet offered no explanation. "Miss Hawthorne," he began, his voice low and measured, "the world will continue to scrutinize our every move. Yet I find that I can no longer defer to convention without acknowledging what is undeniable." Eliza raised her chin, meeting his gaze without faltering. She had rehearsed countless speeches, countless defenses of propriety, yet now the words that mattered were those unspoken between them, carried in glances, gestures, and the shared understanding of nights spent navigating both scandal and conscience. "Your Grace," she replied, her tone steady. "The truth that endures is rarely dictated by society's whims. One may bow to expectation, but it is choice, guided by courage and honor, that defines a life." For a long moment, neither spoke, the silence thick yet charged, punctuated only by the gentle ticking of a grandfather clock and the distant caw of a morning raven. Sebastian finally crossed the room, closing the distance between them with a measured step, the weight of intention behind every motion. "Then I choose," he said, "to recognize the strength of your heart, even where others see only circumstance. I choose to honor the courage that risks all for what is right. And I choose, above all, to honor you." Eliza's heart caught, a surge of warmth mingling with the lingering tension of their previous encounters. The acknowledgement was more than words. It was a public, unassailable declaration within the confines of propriety, a gesture that could withstand the scrutiny of their peers while affirming the truth of their bond. "And I," she murmured, "have found that even amidst the strictures imposed upon us, the heart may act with both dignity and desire. I choose you, Sebastian, not for duty, but for the measure of the man you are and the life we might share together." A subtle shift passed between them, a merging of respect, admiration, and the tender stirrings of love long restrained. Sebastian extended his hand, and Eliza, gloved fingers brushing against his, felt the weight of their mutual acknowledgement, an intimate, deliberate connection that transcended mere social expectation. In that small, deliberate contact, the tension of weeks past dissolved, replaced by the quiet certainty of two minds and hearts aligned, ready to confront the world as partners rather than pawns. Outside, the gardens caught the first full light of morning, droplets shimmering like diamonds along the petals, the sky clearing to reveal a soft expanse of azure. Within, the estate seemed to hold its breath, as though the walls themselves recognized the significance of this reconciliation of heart and duty. Servants moved quietly in the periphery, unnoticed yet attentive, while the distant toll of the church bell marked the passage of time with deliberate grace. Sebastian, usually so precise in command and measured in gesture, allowed the faintest smile to touch his lips. "Let the world speculate," he said quietly, "but we shall navigate it as we choose, with courage, with discretion, and with the truth of our hearts intact." Eliza's own smile mirrored his, a quiet affirmation that the burdens imposed by fortune, expectation, and rumor need not dictate the fullness of life. Together, they had claimed agency over their story, transforming duty into devotion, constraint into shared purpose. The morning waned, yet time seemed suspended, marked only by the gentle rustle of fabric, the soft fall of candlelight as preparations for the day continued, and the unspoken acknowledgement that their bond, once fragile and constrained, had become both unassailable and tender. They walked side by side toward the windows, looking out upon the dew-dappled gardens, a shared silence speaking volumes more than any declaration could. It was a quiet triumph, a victory not over society or scandal, but over fear, hesitation, and the uncertainty of hearts that had dared to hope. And in that suspended, luminous moment, as sunlight spilled across the manor and gilded their features in a warm embrace, Eliza Hawthorne and Sebastian Blackwood understood that the path ahead, though still constrained by convention, would be navigated together. The storm had passed, both without and within, leaving in its wake a sense of possibility, of agency, and of love earned through courage, principle, and quiet defiance. Their story, bound by duty, yet liberated by choice, had reached a culmination not of triumphal pageantry, but of intimate, enduring truth, a resolution that promised both respect and tenderness in equal measure, and the unspoken assurance that whatever shadows remained in the world beyond, they would face them united, unshaken, and wholly aware of the extraordinary bond they had claimed for themselves.